Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 26. Israel Hands. The wind, serving us to a desire, now hauled into the west. We could run so much the easier from the northeast corner of the island to the mouth of the north inlet, only as we had no power to anchor, and dared not to beach her till the tide had flowed a good deal farther. Time hung on our hands. The coxswain told me how to lay the ship to. After a good many trials I succeeded. We both sat in silence over another meal. "Captain," said he, at length, with that same uncomfortable smile, "here's my old shipmate, O'Brien. S'pose you want to heave him overboard. I ain't particular as a rule. I don't want to take no blame for settling his hash. But I don't reckon him ornamental. Now, do you? I'm not strong enough. And I don't like the job. And there he lies, for me," he, said I. "This here's an unlucky ship, the Hispaniola, Jim," he went on, blinking. "There's a power of men had been killed in this Hispaniola, and the sight of old poor seamen in gone since you and me took this ship to Bristol. I'd never seen sich dirty luck, and not I. And there was this here old Brian. Now he's dead, ain't he? Well, I'm no particular skiller, and you're a lad as can read and figure. Now, to put it straight, do you take it as a dead man is dead for good, or he'll come back alive again? You can kill the body, Mr. Hands, but not the spirit. You must know that already, and O'Brien here is in another world, maybe watching us. Ah, well, he, that's unfortunate. Appears as if killing parties were such a waste of time. Howsomever, spirits don't reckon for much, by what I've seen. I'll chance it with the spirits, Jim, and now you've spoken up free, I'll take it kind if you step down into that there cabin and get me well, shiver me timbers, I can't hit the name on it. Well, you get me a bottle of wine, Jim, and this here brandy too strong for my head. Now, the coxswain's hesitation seemed to be unnatural, and as for the notion, preferring wine to brandy, I entirely disbelieve it. And the whole story was a pretext, as he wanted me to leave the deck door. So much was plain, but with what purpose I could in no way imagine. His eyes never met mine. They kept wandering to and fro, up and down, now with a look to the sky, now with a flitting glance upon the dead O'Brien. And all the time he kept smiling, putting his tongue out in the most guilty, embarrassed manner, so that a child could have told that he was bent on some deception. I was prompt with my answer, however, for I saw where my advantage lay, and with a fellow so densely stupid that I could easily conceal my suspicions to the end. "Some wine?" I said. "Far better. Will you have white or red?" "Well, I reckon it's about blessed same to me, shipmate," he replied. "So it's strong, plenty of it. What's the odds?" "All right," I answered. "I'll bring you to port, Mr. Hands, but I'll have to dig for it." And with that I sculled down the companion with all the noise I could, slipped off my shoes, ran quietly along the spare gallery, and mounted on the fore-ladder and popped my head out of the fore companion. I knew he would not expect to see me there, yet I took every precaution possible, and certainly the worst of my suspicions proved to be too true. He had risen from his position to his hands and knees, and though his leg was obviously hurt him pretty sharply when he moved, I could hear him stifle a groan. Yet it was at a good rattling rate as he trailed himself across the deck. In half a minute he reached the port covers and picked out a coil of rope, a long knife, or rather a short dirk, discolored to the hilt with blood. He looked upon it for a moment, thrusting forth under his jaw, and tried the point upon his hands. Then, hastily concealing the bosom of his jacket, trundled back to his old place again in bulwarks. This was all that I required to know. Israel could move about, now that he was armed, and if he had been so much trouble to get rid of me, it was plain that I was meant to be the victim. What he would do afterwards, whether he would try to crawl right under the island of the North Inlet to camp along the swamps, or he'd want to fire Long Tom, trusting his own comrades to come help him, come first to help him, was, of course, more than I could say. Yet I felt sure that I could trust him in one point, since I felt that our interests jumped together, that this was the disposition of the schooner. We both desired to have her stranded safe enough in a sheltered place, so that, when the time came, she should be out again as little as labor, and the danger might be. And, until that was done, I considered that my life would certainly be spared. While I was thus turning my business over in my mind, I'd not been idle with my body. I'd stolen back to the cabin, slipped once more into my shoes, and laid my hand at random on a bottle of wine. And now, with this for an excuse, I made my reappearance on deck. Haynes lay as I left him, all together in a bundle, with his eyelids lowered, as though he was too weak to bear the light. He looked up, however, at my coming, and knocked the neck of off the bottle, like a man who had done the same here often, and he took a good swig, with his favourite toast of "Here's luck." Then he lay quiet for a while, then pulling out a stick of tobacco, begged me to cut him a quid. "Now, cut me a junk o' that," he said, "for I haven't no knife, and hardly strength enough." So be as I had. Ah, Jim, I reckon I missed stays. Cut me a quid, as it'll likely be the last, lad, for I'm my long home. Make no mistake. "Well," said I, "I'll cut you some tobacco, but if I were you, and thought myself so badly, I'd go to my prayers, like a Christian man." "Why? You tell me why." "Why?" I cried. "You were just asking me now about the dead, and you've broken your trust, and you've lived in the sins of lies and blood, and there's a man you killed lying at your feet this moment, and you ask me why? For God's mercy, Mr. Hands, that's why." I spoke with a little heat, thinking of the blood dirk he had hidden in his pocket, and designed to ill his thoughts, to end me with. For his part, he took a great draught of wine, and spoke with the most unusual solemnity. "For 30 years," he said, "I've sailed the seas, and seen the good and bad, better or worse, fair weather and full, provisions running out, knives going, what not, and now I tell you, I've seen no good come o' goodness yet. Him as strikes as my first is fancy. Dead men don't bite. Them is my views. Amen, so be it. Now, if you look here," he added, suddenly changing his tone, "we've had enough of this foolery. Ta the tide's made good enough by now. You take my orders, Captain Hawkins, and we'll sail Slapman and be done with it." All told, we scarce 2 miles to run, but the navigation was delicate, and the entrance to this north anchorage was not only narrow and shoal, but lay east and west, so that the schooner must be nicely handed to be got in. And I think I was a good prompt subaltern, and I am very sure that Hans was an excellent pilot, for we went about and about, dodged in, shaving the banks, with certainty and a neatness that were a pleasure to behold. Scarcely we had passed ahead before the land enclosed around us. The shores of the north inlet were as thickly wooded as those of the southern anchorage, but space was longer and narrower, more like, but in the truth it was, the estuary of the river, right before us at the southern end, and we saw a wreck of a ship in the last main stages of dilapidation. It had been a great vessel of 3 masts, but it had lain so exposed to the injuries of weather that it hung out with about great webs of drifting seaweed. Now on deck of it was a shower of bushes that had taken root, now flourished thick with flowers. It was a sad sight, but it showed us that the anchorage was calm. "Now," said Hans, "look here. There's a pet bit of beach at a ship inn. Fine flat sand, never a cat's paw, trees all around it, flowers a blowing, like a gardening of that old ship." "And once beached," I inquired, "how shall we get her off again?" "Why, so," he replied, "you take a line shore there on the other side of the low water, take a turn on one o' Bitten Pines, bring it back, take a turn round the capstan, lie to for the tide. Come high water, and all hands take a pull on the line. Off she comes as sweet as nature. Now, boy, you stand by. We're near the bit now, and she's too much way for her. Mm. Helm all hard, steady, steady. Starboard a little, so steady, starboard, larboard a little, steady, steady. So he issued his command, while I brusquely obeyed. Still, all of a sudden, he cried, "Now, my hearty luff!" And I put the helm hard up, and the Hispaniola swung around rapidly, and ran on the stern for a long wooded shore. The excitement of these last manoeuvres had somewhat interfered with the watch that I kept hitherto sharply enough upon the coxswain. Even though I was still so much interested, waiting for the ship to touch, I'd quite forgotten the peril that hung over my head. I stood craning over the starboards and bulwarks watching to ripples spreading wide before the bows. I might have fallen without a struggle for my right life, had not but a sudden disquietude seized upon me and made me turn my head, and perhaps I heard a creak, or a shadow moving with the tail of my eye. Perhaps it was an instinct, like a cat. But sure enough, when I looked around, there was Hans, halfway towards me, with the dirk in his right hand. We must have both cried aloud when our eyes met, but while mine was a shrill cry of terror, his was a roar of fury like a charging bull. At the same instant he threw himself forward. I leaped sideways towards the bow. As I did so, I left a hold of the tiller, which sprang sharp into the leewards, and I think this saved my life, for it struck Hans across the chest, stopped him for the moment, dead. Before he could recover, I was safe out of the corner where he had me trapped, with all the deck to dodge about. Just forward for the mainmast, I stopped, drew a pistol from my pocket, took a cool aim, although he had already turned and was once more coming for me directly, and drew the trigger. The hammer fell, but there followed neither flash nor sound, and the priming was useless with sea water. I cursed myself for neglect. Why had I not before reprimed and loaded my only weapons? I shouldn't have not been, as now, a mere fleeing sheep before this butcher. Wounded as he was, it was wonderful how fast he could move, his grizzled hair tumbling over his face still red and sign with his haste and fury. I had no time to try my other pistol, nor, indeed, much inclination, for I was sure it would be useless. Once I saw plainly I must not simply retreat before him, or he would speedily hold me in box to the bows. As a moment he had no nearly boxed me into the stern. Once so caught, 9 or 10 inches of blood-stained dirk would be my last experience on this side of eternity. I placed my palms against the mainmast, which was a goodish bigness. I waited, every nerve upon the stretch. Seeing that I meant to dodge, he also paused, and a moment or two passed in defiance of his part, gave the corresponding movements upon mine. It was such a game that I had often played at home on the rocks of the Black Hill Cove, but never before, you may be sure, with such a wildly beating heart as now. Still, as I say, it was a boy's game, and I thought I could hold my own at it against such an elderly seaman with a wounded thigh. Indeed, my courage began to rise so high, I allowed myself a few darting thoughts about what would be the end of the affair, and while I saw a certainty that I would spin it for long, I saw no hope of any ultimate escape. Well, while things stood thus, suddenly the Hispaniola struck, staggered, ground for an instant in the sand, then, swift as a blow, canted over the port side until the decks took at an angle of 45 degrees. About a puncheon of water splashed into the scupper holes, and lay in a pool between the deck and bulwarks. We were both capsized in seconds, and both of us rolled together, with scuppers, and dead Redcap, with his arms still spread out, tumbling stiffly after us. So near were we, indeed, that my head came against the coxswain's foot, with a crack that made my teeth rattle. Blow and all, I was first afoot again, for Hans had got involved with the dead body, and suddenly canting of the ship had made the deck no place for running on. I had to find some new way of escape that upon an instant, for my foe was almost touching me. Quick as I thought, I sprang into the mizzen shrouds, rattled up hand over hand, did not draw a breath till I was seated across the trees. It had been saved being prompt. The jerk had struck not a half foot below me, and I pursued my upward flight. There stood Israel Hands with his mouth open and face upturned to mine, a perfect statue of surprise and disappointment. Now that I had a moment to myself, I lost no time in changing the priming of the pistol. Then, having one ready for my service, to make assertion doubly sure, I proceeded to draw the load of the other, and recharge it afresh from the beginning. My new employer struck hands all of a heap. He began to see the dice going against him, and after an obvious hesitation, he also hauled himself heavily into the shrouds, and, with a dirk of his teeth, began slowly and painfully to mount. It costed him no end of time and groans to haul his wounded leg behind him. I'd quite I'd hardly finished my arrangements before he was much more than third way up. Then, with a pistol in each hand, I addressed him. "One more step, Mr. Haynes," said I, "and I'll blow your brains out. Dead men don't bite, you know," I added, with a chuckle. He stopped instantly, but I could see the working of his face, that he was trying to think, and the process was so slow and laborious that in my new-found security I laughed aloud, and at last, with a swallow or two, he spoke, with his face still wearing the same expression of extreme perplexity. It is old to speak that he had taken the dagger from his mouth, but in all he remained unmoved. "Jim," he said, "I reckon we've fooled, you and me, and have to sign articles. I've had you for that there lurch, but I'd no luck, not I. And I reckon I have to strike. When it comes hard, you'll see, for a master mariner to a ship's younker like you, Jim." He was drinking in his words and smiling away, as conceited as a cock upon a wall, when all in a breath, back went to his right hand and shoulder. Something sang like an arrow through the air, and I felt a blow and a sharp pang. Then I was pinned by the shoulder toward the mast, and a horrid pain and surprise. I can scarce say it was my own volition, and I am sure it was a conscious aim. Both my pistols went off, and both escaped on my hands. They did not fall alone. With a choked cry, the coxswain loosed his grasp around the shrouds and plunged head first into the water.